Dr. Pitti is Professor of History at Yale University. Dr. Stephen Pitti.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Ramon in particular for having set this up, along with Tom Izu at De Anza College and Kathy Blackmer-Reyes at San Jose State. I've given many talks, but I'm not sure I've ever been so nervous for a single one of them. And I can tell you very clearly why that is. The reason for that is that I've never been trying to talk about work about San Jose in a group of such distinguished local residents. There are more than one member of this audience whom I interviewed for this book, and several others who I read about in local newspapers and other accounts in order to write the book, and still more whose work I read, be that master's theses or dissertations or something produced for public readership that really did go into this book. What I wanted to do, and though this is a daunting task to think about exposing myself to any, much less all of them, plus the rest of you, it's a real pleasure to be here. As Dr. Martinez said, I'm from Northern California. I spent a long period of time in the San Jose area. This book was really a labor of love that took a long time to do, and a lot of my own blood, sweat, and tears. But more than my own blood, sweat, and tears, it really depended upon enormous amounts of help and enormous amounts of human resources from local people. At the core of this book are the stories told to me in oral histories that I did personally or that others had done and collected with people who had spent time in this area in the 20th century. And so though I sort of stand responsible for what lies between these covers, it is in a very, very real way, and not in a cliched way, the product of the work and the generosity, the spirit and the brilliance, I think, of Latinos, Hispanics in the South Bay area. What I thought I would do today is try to give you a sense of the book, give you a sense of my take on this part of California and Latino residents. It was said that Hispanics, Latinos are the future of California, and I suppose at its core my pitch is that we are also the past. And it's very, very important to recognize our past as we work towards a better future for particularly the working class residents of this state, the immigrant, the often excluded. In order to set up what I hope will be an interesting conversation in which all of us will participate, I wanted to say something about how and why I wrote this book. I wanted to read a few pages from it, hopefully not to put you to sleep at this early hour of the morning. And then I want to say, by way of conclusion, what I think I suggest, why it's so important that we do history, why we think about history, why we remain attentive not just to the Hispanic future and present, but also the Hispanic past. I think it's absolutely critical, and each and every one of us in this room, I think, has a role to play in that project. As was suggested, I wrote this as a dissertation first at Stanford University, just up the 101. I was then in the Department of History doing a PhD in a very sort of boring and traditional manner. But I was at school in a time when all of you will remember was a very difficult time, as it still is, for Latinos in the state of California. I was doing my coursework, I was researching, and I was trying to establish a project just as Proposition 187 was passing, and then thereafter Propositions 209 and 227. And so it seemed very clear to me that one of the things that most deserved all of our attention was looking at ways to really establish the presence, the current presence, but also the past presence of Latinos in this state, in the face of public policy arguments that seem continually to invent Latinos as if we had just arrived. And so what I wanted to do as an historian, as I was looking towards doing a doctorate, was really establish what I hoped would be a clear-cut case that this is a population with roots deeper than the Anglo population's roots in this place, with a history that's rich, that's complex, but that deserves to be known. I wanted to do a project that would be reputable to scholars and experts, but that even more would be usable in public settings. This is one never fully succeeds at this sort of thing, but it was my hope that, that I could produce something about the history of Latinos in San Jose and in the Santa Clara Valley area that would get into those kind of introductory courses at places like San Jose State, De Anza College, where I was yesterday, San Jose City College, and elsewhere, precisely because I think that this is so important that our 18, 19, 20-year-olds have some sense that there is history here, and that what they may encounter on the radio, on the television, in the newspaper, and so forth, is thin at best. I wanted to do something about Northern California because I'm from Northern California, but I was too scared to do San Francisco and too scared to do my hometown of Sacramento because I knew too many people there. And in a sense, it really was the generosity and the welcome that I was given by San Jose activists in the 1990s, in the labor movement broadly, in civil rights circles, some of them are here today, that encouraged me to take on the South Bay. When I started this project, I thought that I was going to write a history that would start in World War II. I think in this sense, I was a victim of the myths that I think I hope to go on and debunked, which is to say that I was a victim of the assumption that there wasn't a ton of Latino history in this area before the 1940s. And what I expected to do was really devote a lot of attention to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and hopefully get into the 80s and 90s. But as I did my research, I found more and more tremendously interesting stories about the Latino past that predated the 1940s, a past that was not just about the arrival of Spanish conquistadores, not just about Mission Santa Clara and San Jose, not just about Pueblo San Jose, but was it about living people, everyday people, working people, people who struggled in ways that look very familiar to those of us who lived in the 20th century. And what I came to as an organizing principle, you can see in the title. The organizing principle of the work that I've done on San Jose is organized around the idea of race and racism. It's an argument that from the 18th century into the present day, what organizes the history of Latinos in this part of the country, and not just this part of the country, but in particular here, is the profound importance of racial discrimination in shaping group experiences. At the same time, it's just as important to recognize the profound centrality of efforts to combat racial discrimination as very fundamental to Latino communities in this place. And by way of trying to capture that, I settled on this figure of the devil, which you'll see depicted on the cover and as well as in the title. And to give you a sense of where that figure of the devil came from, I wanted to read to you a paragraph from the very first page of the book. I wrote, "The devil of this book's title is drawn from an anecdote told to a University of California, Berkeley anthropologist. In the form of a donkey, the devil is said to have walked into the San Jose mission. Several native Ohlone neophytes were mission Indians who were in residence at Mission San Jose. Several native Ohlone neophytes then climbed up for a ride, the donkey wondrously elongating to accommodate them. One Indian, spying the fact that the donkey had 3 cloven feet and one rooster's foot, warned the others. The donkey then tossed them and vanished." There are a number of interpretations of this tale told to the early 20th century Berkeley ethnographer, but I prefer the simplest. Beginning in the late 18th century, a new understanding of racial difference infiltrated the valley, bringing with it patterns of conquest and violence, really important themes, which in turn begged patterns of accommodation and resistance. Over the 200 years with which this book is concerned, ideologies of race, like the devil, took on different forms. They assumed different guises, and they extracted varying costs. But the manifestations of violence, which always attend racism, were at its most constant feature. And the simplest lesson learned from the 200-year history of this storied valley are 2. First, that the label Silicon Valley, which follows on the heels of the region's fame as an entrepot for gold rush hopefuls, then as a home to one of the world's largest mercury mines, then as an Edenic spot for the cultivation of perishable cash crops, that this label Silicon Valley will be replaced by something else is a near certainty. Almost as certain as the second lesson, that race will continue to delineate the valley's economic, social, and political possibilities, regardless of booster monikers. With this idea of the devil, I tried to, as the donkey did, stretch a story and put many social actors on board over the course of the 200 years that I tried to describe, from roughly the arrival of the Spanish until not quite yesterday, but not so long ago, sometime in the late 20th century. And what I really tried to capture in this book is something that I think we all need to continue to do, understand the kind of local myths, the local stories that are told in everyday fashion, the dominant stories that are told about places like this one, understand those myths for what's true about them, but also what's fundamentally missed, what's fundamentally elided, how those myths actually work to replace any true understanding of what a place like this has actually meant. In other words, as we think about what we tell ourselves it means to live in a place like this, we have to understand what those myths are saying about the past and the future. I conclude the book in the following way. Let me read from this conclusion in order to give you a sense of some of the themes and the contents, which I hope will help to generate a discussion. I wrote that the late 20th century was for me a very propitious moment to capture memories of San Jose's last surviving Mexican immigrants who had arrived here more than 50 years before. In other words, in the 1940s and 1950s, principally. Those residents seemed intent to reflect on the history of the region, in part because many faced new challenges in the 1990s. Despite the booming economy, the political air was strangely poisonous. Bitter thanks to the ongoing social problems that many observers associated with Mexican immigration. Draconian public policies at the state level threatened to limit immigrants' access to publicly funded hospitals, schools, and welfare services, Proposition 187, as you know. Crackdowns against bilingual education, spearheaded by a local Valley businessman, combined with widespread opposition to affirmative action, new challenges to federal welfare laws, and growing economic disparities between the Valley's rich and poor, all of which seem to threaten the livelihoods of this Valley's low-wage workers. New national initiatives during the 1990s to police the US-Mexico border threatened the safety of undocumented Mexican immigrants, even as the passage of NAFTA in 1994 accelerated transnational processes already underway. And somehow the so-called information superhighway seemed too often to bypass the East Side. The late 20th century was a time of startling change, but it also witnessed manifestations of old patterns of race relations in the American West. My archival digging and in-depth interviews made clear to me that the Santa Clara Valley has been a site of real contention and at times internecine rivalries for more than 100 years. It's also played host to central developments in Mexican-American history broadly, this place has, including the rise of corporate agriculture, a major part of the San Jose story, changing patterns of urbanization, and the development of a Latino civil rights movement. Many aspects of San Jose's hidden past had national and international implications. But few in California have yet fully to acknowledge just how deeply connected Latinos have been to this region. Local boosters deserve much of the blame. First helping to displace ethnic Mexicans in the gold rush era of the 1850s, and then robbing local people of their rightful histories. Low-wage labor, physical hardship, and vibrant political activism nonetheless defined this valley of gold, of fruit, of mercury, of silicon, but primarily of people for decades. The history of Latinos in the Silicon Valley explodes local myths about the area's universal prosperity and social peace. Knowledge of the past ought certainly to put to rest the now tired celebrations of high-tech entrepreneurs, and we ought to stress instead that the twin forces of conquest and immigration from Latin America have been far more central to local dynamics. Wave after wave of Mexicanos have settled in San Jose for more than 150 years. Conquest and migration have elicited unsavory responses from many local residents, And Californians ought to be held accountable for the often violent treatment of Mexican Americans that they have meted out from the 1850s forward. Those who continue to struggle on behalf of disenfranchised populations might take heart in the ways that in the ways that politically active Latinos have defied the logic of local xenophobes for generations, hounding boosters and pressing for new political rights in this city. The vibrant labor, electoral, and transnational movements underway by the early 21st century here are in fact an extension and an elaboration of past San Jose efforts by miners, exiles, and farm workers, forgotten Northern California forebearers of today's dynamic oppositional politics. Matters of history and memory have taken on new importance today as growing numbers of Latinos throughout the United States argue for their political and economic rights. Visions of history guide progressive movements always, I think. Visions of history always guide movements for change in the future. Although none today can claim to remember the early strikes in Santa Clara County of the 1860s, those whom I interviewed in the 1990s in valley homes, on rooftops, in bowling alleys, at a local IHOP, and elsewhere, did express considerable frustration about the high-tech robber barons so beloved by the local press. Many who shared with me their memories had grown angry that popular accounts of the region's high-tech growth routinely failed to include any mention of Mexicans or Mexican Americans. Their frustration had been building for years, and local Latinos expressed particular outrage in 1990 at the proposed erection of a statue commemorating Thomas Fallon, that seldom remembered quote-unquote pioneer credited with raising the first American flag in the valley during the Mexican War. That statue, like so much else, was pure romance, a historical cover-up in the 1990s that hid a much uglier past. Many local Latinos continued to criticize journalists who appeared too sanguine about the valley's future, too ready to promote this area as a place of entrepreneurial freedom, the quote-unquote Wild West of private enterprise, and seemingly too intent to forget the Latino presence. Like dominated groups elsewhere in the world, ethnic Mexicans here have clung for generations to their own counter-narratives that explained their place in local history. In drawing attention to past farm labor and past cannery work done by these populations, some continue to contest official narratives of Silicon Valley's development. Residents who'd been activists in the local Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s have played particularly important roles in the 20th century in urging the city to pay greater attention to Latino history. Such efforts have developed hand in hand with the movement of greater number of Mexican Americans into local governments, indeed into leadership positions like those already introduced here today. Investigations of the past, activists have frequently argued, must be a more democratic enterprise, an effort to understand, for example, the subordination of local Latinos in the 19th and 20th centuries. Many have demanded, therefore, that the Valley celebrate a much more multicultural cast of local heroes. After a coalition of Mexican Americans defeated the first plans to construct the Fallon Monument, they managed, therefore, to see the completion of two other local statues downtown, those to Ernesto Galarza and Quetzalcoatl. It was in this spirit, I think. My sense of Silicon Valley's history emerged in conversations with residents in this room and with other residents interested in promoting a rebellious, but I think more accurate version of San Jose's past. I wrote in the 1990s and the early 20th century with an eye to growing concerns about immigrant civil liberties expressed here in San Jose and elsewhere, and I carried out my research in the immodest hope that a book like this one might make some difference in the region's future. What I discovered over time was a counter-history that tells a story of broad importance, capturing conflicts about race seen in many other areas of the country. I took many of my cues from local Latino artists in particularly the 1981 Poema para los Californios Muertos, written by the one-time San Josean Lorna di Cervantes, a poem that underscores the vital importance of Latino histories throughout the American West. The poet Cervantes' observations serve here as a fitting coda to any meditation on the California past. Like other Mexican Americans, she excoriated the Santa Clara Valley's longstanding penchant for obscuring the formative importance of Latinos here and obscuring the formative importance of race relations. She began her verse by citing a simple plaque found at a restaurant in Los Altos that reminded visitors that this place, the restaurant, was, quote, once a refuge for Mexican Californios. Chilled by the way in which such romantic language cloaked the state's vivid history of violence. In other words, how can this plaque that says once a refuge for Mexican Californios in any way capture the history of Mexicans in the area? Chilled by such romantic language's cloaking of violence, Cervantes evoked the processes that made, quote, Californios moan like husbands of the raped, husbands de la tierra, tierra de la madre, in language that must have shocked any Valley booster still interested in reviving that once popular Fiesta de las Rosas, that parade that some of you may remember from 1969. Cervantes rejected facile Spanish myths about local history, describing the San Jose area instead as, quote, a bastard child, this city, lost in the soft, llorando de las madres. And she remembered 19th century Mexican Americans as los antepasados muertos. Insisting on a more accurate rendering of the booming Silicon Valley, this poem asked, quote, what refuge did you find here, ancient Californios? Now at this restaurant, nothing remains but this old oak and an ill-placed plaque. Is it true that you still live here? In the shadows of these white, high-class houses, yo soy la hija pobrecita, pero puedo maldecir estas fantasmas blancas. Las fantasmas tuyas deben aquí quedarse, sola las tuyas. Like many other San Joseans, Cervantes continued to lambast self-satisfied visions that have long defined the Santa Clara Valley as a pastoral place, insisting instead that episodes of violence still haunt this region. As many Latinos have known firsthand, Silicon Valley has long been a place of great hardship for those deemed non-white. But ethnic Mexicans and others have also challenged the damning inequalities of, quote, life in the shadow of these white high-class houses. I want to submit to you that it falls to historians, but also to everyone in this room, to help throw light into those shadows if scholars, poets, activists, and others are to continue beating back the stubborn devil of discrimination that continues to haunt this area and other parts of the United States. Let me conclude with just a few comments about where I see history now. This book, when I wrote it, when it was published, was the only thing that I knew about in book form that was about the history of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the Santa Clara Valley. There were really wonderful, important articles, dissertations, but it was shockingly true that there really wasn't anything in print and at the book level. And for a community so important as this one, the absence of such books on library shelves, on bookstore shelves, and still the virtual absence of them, I think remains very, very shocking. So this book was published a few years back, and it does a part of this history, but much, much more remains to be done. I think that it falls to all of us to push forward a real historical memory in this place among peoples in our families, in our neighborhoods, and in our organization, a sense of history that really matters for the here and now. History that will engage the young, people who, to no fault of their own, have no sense of the history of Latinos in California, in the United States, much less in the San Jose area and the broader Bay Area. History that will engage those who are not so young. I don't want to look at anybody while I'm making this comment, people who have seen history and are now at the point in their own lives where they are at a moment where they need to share with us, with the rest of us, what they have known, what they have seen, their experiences and their perspectives. I can tell you it's always been my perspective that this is good for everyone. This is, of course, precisely what young people need, but it's also what those who have lived history need to do. There's something deeply satisfying and necessary about sharing one's experiences. And we live in a time in which too many people who have seen history have no opportunity to talk about it. They live in families or in situations where they aren't able to share all of the things they have seen and known. And I think this is deeply difficult for many people in our communities. We need a history that matters for public policy. This doesn't mean that all history has to be policy related, but in a time in which Latinos are under such attack by some in the policymaking community, we do need to remain attentive to the policy implications of our research agendas, of the stories we tell, because to do so would be to be blind to current realities. This is what I think is important about history in this moment and why it's important to young and old and policymakers and others. Let me make a pitch for the kind of history that I think we really need to actually be doing, what we really need to put at the very center of our efforts. I want to make a pitch that the most important history to be writing about Latinos generally, but certainly Latinos in this area, are histories that really look at the mid-20th century, histories of the years of the 1940s and the 1950s, when Latinos in San Jose and elsewhere really boomed in numbers and took on new places in American society, when they brought with them traditions from Texas in some cases, many people from Del Rio, of course, who came to the San Jose area, from Eagle Pass and elsewhere, but of course also from Mexico. This incredibly important time of the 1940s and 1950s when we see many people participating for the first time in very large numbers in the armed services, right, which of course continues to resonate into the 21st century, where we see people moving into union jobs, but also out of union jobs, see the first sustained efforts to elect Latino public officials in this period and so forth. And I think this is critical as a critical moment in Latino history, but the moment is now for capturing that history precisely because we stand at great risk of losing the opportunity to speak with many members of that generation who, as you know, are reaching their elder years. Many have already passed away. And these populations, of course, Latino populations, are regrettably not always long-lived populations, having done work and lived under circumstances of great duress for their entire lives. We can't anticipate that these people will live into their 90s and past the century mark, and we need desperately to focus a lot of attention on capturing the stories of those who remember the 1940s and 1950s. The second thing I want to say about a research agenda is that I think we need Latino histories that put Latinos at the center and not at the margins of the stories we tell. I think we can tell those stories about a place like San Jose throughout much of the period. If you begin, of course, in the years of the Spanish Entrada in the 18th century, in the years at which San Jose was part of Mexico, and in the years in which Mexicans remained an important demographic presence and then became an even greater demographic presence in the 20th century. But whatever we do, whatever projects we take on, we should resist marginalization. And this is because marginalization is simply not accurate to the facts. We've not been marginal to the history of the United States. We've been critically important and central to the history of the United States. And I will also say that Latinos have also been critically important to the histories of Latin America. And so in thinking about Latino histories, we have opportunities to think about the very most important things that we think about in the past of the United States, but also of the hemisphere at large. By way of concluding and opening this up to what I hope will be comments and questions from you, let me say that the project that engages me now tries to do a couple of these things. In some sense, you might say this is all a big setup for celebrating my project, because the project that I'm working on now does look centrally at the 1940s and 1950s and tries to continue to push on the centrality of Latinos to history and not their marginal status. This is a project which really began as a biography of one of San Jose's great residents, Cesar Estrada Chavez. who of course lived in this town in the 1940s and 1950s and remained very, very tied to this place through family networks, through friends, until his death in 1993. The Chavez Project, I think, is one example of the kind of project that really pushes our understanding of major issues in US history and in Latin American history, questions about immigration, rights, race, racism, and other things. It's allowing me to better understand the history of the Santa Clara Valley through the figure of Chavez and the organizations, principally the community service organization of East San Jose that he was involved with, and to place him in a context that's also local. It's a way to understand that generation that came of age around World War II that I think many of us have not paid enough attention to over time. In the rush to think about the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, I think we too often fail to think about those who were active doing very interesting things, some of them similar to those of later generations, but during the years of World War II and directly thereafter. A project on Cesar Chavez also allows us to think about the relationship between Latinos and non-Latinos in this area, because one of the central concerns of first the community service organization with which Chavez was involved, and later, of course, the United Farm Workers of the 1960s forward, was the establishment of political coalitions of supporters who were not just Mexicans and Mexican Americans or other Latinos, but came from all walks of life and all backgrounds. And in thinking about a person like Chavez, this emblematic San Josean, we realize in thinking about him just how important his place, not just to Latinos is, but his place in broader American history and how many non-Latinos he and many others touched in the 20th century. The final point I'll make is that the Chavez Project allows us to think about discrimination and the ways it's been persistent but also combated over time. In some sense, this pulls me back to the devil of Silicon Valley, because in a real way, I think that generation of the 1940s and 1950s, some of whom are in this room, were among the most successful and creative in pushing back and in battling that devil, which I think continues to be the project of many of us as we move into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Why is our contribution to the civil rights movement neglected by the Eastern media and historians in general?
Oh, God. Do I win money if I answer these correctly? Boy, why? So why? Well, I guess there's two possible answers to this. One, we haven't tried hard enough, or two, we've been neglected repeatedly, and it's taken a great amount of work to neglect. The story of America, as it's usually told in the textbooks for at least 100 years, and you could make certainly longer than that, in the textbook accounts are all about African Americans and whites when it comes to stories about making this a better place, the kind of fulfillment of the vision that is supposedly embodied in our great founding documents. The story that's always been told, of course, is about the first and second Reconstruction of America. You know, the abolition of slavery and the Civil War, and yet the persistence of racial inequality after the Civil War, and not until the 1950s and the 1960s, with the coming of King and other black leaders, would we see the real Reconstruction of America, the making of a place that was, freedom, in which freedom for all was more realizable. That's the story, and of course this is an important story. It's a story with truth in it, but it's a story that of course misses California, it misses Texas, it misses major populations all over the country, Latinos being the most important. It's not a story that's going to stand for long, obviously, as Latinos have increased in importance and in numbers and in influence, not just in California, but in Nebraska, and in virtually every other place from coast to coast to Hawaii to Alaska. There has to be a reckoning with this. And I suppose part of the problem is that there continues to be a gap. It was mentioned earlier how the low numbers of Latino superintendents in the state of California, and what a tremendous gap that is between the number of Latino school kids. Well, the same is true in the ranks of the writers and the scholars, the graduate students, the professors, that there are still shockingly few Latinos who are doing the work of telling, of writing those books, telling school kids what really happened and what really matters. That's an enormous problem, and we need badly, there's so many things we need to do, but one of them is send people on first to get their undergraduate degrees and then get their graduate degrees in the hopes that they might change the way we think about the civil rights movement.
What historic sites in Sacramento do you recommend?
You know, this is, I grew up with, my father joined the Chicano Studies faculty at Sacramento State in 1970, and so been pretty involved in public history conversations for the last 35 or more years in Sacramento. Sacramento hasn't done a very good job with its history either. It has many of the same problems that San Jose and this area has had in terms of paying a lot of attention to certain issues and missing other ones completely. Everything there, as you know, is about the gold rush, which of course is wonderful on the one hand, though you'd be hard-pressed to find out much from the public sites about the Chinese, about the Latinos, about Indians and others in Sacramento. But I think it's always worth going to the Railroad Museum. That's always a nice place to go and can satisfy young and old.
Dr. Octavio Romano led the counterattack against social science researchers who came to San Jose, wrote doctoral dissertations that depicted Mexican Americans as docile and unorganized. What's being done now at San Jose State, Stanford, NHU, or other universities to support research on Mexican American history that is more accurate?
Well, not enough, but I mean, certainly one thing that has happened is that there are very important people who care about these things at those institutions and others and who are trying. But clearly there are issues of resources and priorities within the institutions which have marginalized these issues and these kinds of projects more than they should be. Let me just tell, I don't have a good answer to this, but let me tell you that one of the good stories that's connected to this question about the history of San Jose is that in 1952, the community service organization, which I mentioned and others have mentioned, was organized by a man named Fred Ross, who was a terrific name in California history that should be known much better than it is. Fred Ross had worked in the resettlement administration around Japanese Americans in the 1940s. He'd been an activist in the 1930s. Also in the farm labor camps. In fact, the very camp that was described by John Steinbeck in Grapes of Wrath, he worked there, and in the 1950s was interested in organizing Mexican Americans. When Ross came to East San Jose in 1952 and met with people like the Chavez family, they assumed that he was, quote, another social scientist coming from San Jose State to study the problems of the Mexican people. So it's to say that there is a kind of persistent problem with this, which matters not just for academia, but for the ways in which people in our communities perceive academia that is really worth trying to do away with.
Are you aware of the effort to save the Juana Briones home in Palo Alto? There's a court case hearing on June 5 in San Jose.
You know, I'm aware of it, and I'm certainly very excited about the possibilities there. I haven't been involved in that, to my regret, and if there's anything that I can do at this late date, I'm very eager to jump on the bandwagon.
Speaking of Juana Briones, there's people here from Juana Briones, friends of Juana Briones, and I also want to recognize a person's not here, but Mr. Tony Quintero put up all those copies of a collection of California newspapers, and he's part of that group, so I want to thank Tony Quintero for his work. My understanding is that the school walkouts occurred in San Jose before Los Angeles. Do you know anything about that?
They did, I think. I think that's right. I have to think about my calendar here. They did occur here first. But the other thing I would say is that actually the first organized Mexican-American student organization of the 1960s occurred here at San Jose State and at San Jose City, a group called SI, Student Initiative, and they always said the accent is on initiative. And this was an important forerunner which occurred earlier than the walkouts, and it was a kind of bridge organization, in a sense, between the activism and the organizations that had been ongoing in San Jose and elsewhere in the earlier period, and what would really come alive in 1968, 1969, 1970. It's an important organization because, among other things, those young people involved in C were very interested in articulating the importance of studying Mexican Americans in a different way, and they were interested in involving themselves in the farm worker strikes that were hitting the Central Valley around Delano, and really giving back. So in some sense, it's a very important part of San Jose's history and of, again, American history that needs to be recognized.
Right now, this is all the time we have for questions, but because we want to leave time for you to talk to Dr. Pitti and talk to each other at the end of the program. And I don't want to run over our budget, our budgeted time. Dr. Pitti?
I just want to say one thing I didn't quite say, and that is I really do want to urge everybody to do more to go about collecting the history of our community. And so if you remember nothing else from this talk, please consider ways in which you might help to archive and collect the stories of people who have seen history happen and whose stories really need to be available to the next generations of students and researchers, journalists, and others. We badly need this. It's not always easy to write Latino history, and we really depend on the work of librarians and archivists like Jeff Paul, who may now have left, and others to do this. So please make it your business to help gather those things. If you can't find a repository for them, please contact me, and I'll do what I can to bring anything I can to Yale, although there's certainly a terrific set of options in the local area which probably make more sense than that.